The worse reputation of Dark Souls 2 bosses didn't come out of nowhere, obviously. There were more or less valid reasons as to why this sentiment spread so easily. The first one I'm going to talk about relates to the combat system as a whole, that being hitboxes, and the widespread idea that Dark Souls 2 has shitty ones, and that it's such an omnipresent problem within the game that the bosses are automatically worse because of it. I'll have to repeat myself once again. Dark Souls 2 is unfairly singled out for an issue that plagues all entries in the series. Every game in this franchise has some really clean, good hitboxes here and there, and some shitty, stupid ones in a lot of places. Dark Souls 2 having the worst ones is a myth. There are some enemies with consistently bad ones. The Elite Giants, for example, the Hide Knights or these orange dogs as well. Even the Mimic has a really weird hitbox during its wake-up animation, but to me it feels like a deliberate troll from the devs. There are probably other examples of enemies with broken hitboxes, but I can't quite think of any right now. And I'm sure some of you are already linking some compilations or listing all the enemies and bosses that you think fit the criteria, but I'll simply stop you with two words: grab attacks. In all of these games, grab attacks work the same. If the grab attack hitbox collides with the player hitbox outside of an invulnerability window, the player model is teleported into a predetermined position to allow the grab animation to play properly. Is this a good system? Debatable. Does it often look wonky and unfair? Yes. Could it have been done way better? Obviously. Is Dark Souls 2 specifically at fault for this issue? No, it's not. Grab attacks follow the same rules in Dark Souls 2 as they do in other titles. If you get hit by the Pursuer glowing sword attack, you are getting impaled, even if it looked like you dodged it. I don't like it, but it's one of those janky quirks about the series everyone should be familiar with by this point. And that's without taking into account the fact that not only across the series, but in most video games in general, hitboxes are almost always larger than the actual weapon or character models they are based on. This is a conscious game design decision, motivated by reasons related to playability and player feedback. Sometimes, like in most Souls games, they go a bit overzealous and it looks wrong, but it's a consistent issue. It's for example very prevalent with thrusting attacks and thin weapons. Again, I have to ask, why is Dark Souls 2 in particular the one who receives all the blame? Oh, wait, I know why, I think. It's because of our old friend agility. In the other games, since the character has generally more iframes by default, players simply don't notice the poor hitboxes. They can easily roll through everything as if they phased out of existence for a few frames. But in DS2, unless you invest into the stat first, that's not so easy to do. So large hitboxes become more obvious, despite not being actually worse compared to the other entries. And this goes back to grab attacks. In DS2 you have less margin of error on average if you try to roll through them. So you're going to see the wonky teleport happen more often. If you believe this makes the agility mechanic more flawed, rather than being an issue with the hitboxes themselves, I can understand it. But I also disagree and think it's a stupid position to hold. Stop rolling through attacks if you don't have a lot of iframes. It's not that hard. Use your dodge as, a dodge. And believe me, once you do, you will start seeing these mythological shitboxes less and less. Another reason why poor hitboxes seem more common in DS2 might have to do with the style of animations. Enemies in this game tend to move slowly, more so than the other titles, with very continuous movements. Very few attacks have exaggerated twitching, instantaneous downswings, or other elements that are more common in Miyazaki's games. The animation style used in those other entries hides poor or questionable hitboxes much better, while in DS2, since the action is far more readable, the jank becomes easier to spot in the process. I'd argue it's a positive. I don't think anyone in their right mind can somehow claim that worse readability is better only because it hides imperfections. Not in a game like this, at least. Dark Souls it's about deliberate action. You need to be in control of your character and be fully aware of what's going on during combat. So if an hitbox is larger than you'd expect, it's far better for that to be obvious and fast something that you can consistently counter and predict after seeing it once or twice. On the other hand, you could have 12 playthroughs of Bloodborne and never have noticed any of the worst hitboxes, simply because the increased speed and less readable animations hide them better. But is this different, slower and more readable animation style better or worse? This also connects back to what I said about weapon animation. Is it better to have twitchy, satisfying hits, or more realistic and fluid weapon swings? While in that previous context I think it mostly came down to personal preference, when talking about enemy design, I believe it's a more complicated topic. I would say that I prefer an enemy to be clear, readable and fair, for its animations to be slow and continuous, without any obvious gaps in movement of weapons or body parts, but at the same time, reception towards DS2 combat, enemy design and boss design makes me think I'm in a minority that isn't worth catering to. From what I can see, people genuinely believe that the animation style and the way bosses and enemies move in games like Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring is preferable. It probably makes getting hit by these attacks more impactful, but ultimately what I think it boils down to is that it makes them look cooler. Because yes, I think that's the main reason DS2 bosses are so disliked. Even DS1, which had much sober animations compared to the following Miyazaki entries, still had bosses that simply looked cooler than 2. They were weightier, more menacing and imposing. For example, I'm not a fan of Asylum's demon design, but when I fight him I feel like I'm genuinely there, as a fantasy adventurer trying to take down this giant monster. Dark Souls 2 often lacks that feeling. Jabba the Hutt is the closest analog I can think of, a gross fat demon that is slow and pathetic. And while I like this design in its simplicity, it lacks the same presence as his DS1 bigger brother. We can also compare Calamith and Sin. I like the design of the latter much more, and the arena looks more dramatic, but ultimately Calamith was better animated. An issue Sin shares with some other enemies is the choppiness of some animations, specifically the wings. But it's not the kind of choppiness that adds impact to the animations, which is a very commonly used trick in other Souls games and the industry as a whole. In this case, it feels more like lack of polish. And it's not just about animations, it's about the graphical fidelity of the game itself. This goes beyond the bosses, and I think that after all the things I've said, you might see what I mean when I say that a lot of Dark Souls 2 hatred stems primarily from its visuals. The other games in the series have better presentation. They look less like video games and more like moving paintings at times. Dark Souls 2 doesn't really do that, it's much more straightforward and cleaner in its visuals, and this includes the simplistic way bosses and enemies look. This issue, which encompasses the entire game, is in my opinion one of the major catalysts for the distaste it receives among the fanbase. You could spend hours analyzing the moveset of each boss, the fairness of each attacks, the preciseness of each hitbox, and the complexity of the AI. But ultimately, what forges common sentiment and popular opinions are the superficial elements of a piece of work. Because most people don't really look in depth at things, they stop at the surface, the apparent and the obvious. And the DS2 isn't that much worse looking overall than DS1 or DS3. Each game has its strengths and weaknesses between graphics, art style and animations, or lighting and other factors. But DS2 is the one that looks the most video gamey. It's the odd one out. It feels different from the others because of it. And that's on top of all the actual mechanical changes and design decisions that, on their own, make it feel different. Dark Souls 2 is a game that looks worse than it actually plays. I remember that before playing the game myself, I was watching gameplays of it, and I thought the bosses looked terrible. I said to myself, oh, the game looks fun, but the bosses seem worse than the ones from the first game. Then I actually played the game and realized that I was misguided. It was an issue of animations and visual style, but in terms of gameplay the bosses were arguably, on average, more interesting than the ones in Dark Souls 1. But that's just me. What about the rest of the community? Well, all it takes is a few internet personalities, or people with some degree of intellectual authority speaking in a microphone, to condition the masses into thinking certain things. If your favorite YouTuber says DS2 has the worst boss fights, and then you play the game and the different visuals and different gameplay style tell your brain that something is off, then it's only natural that a more conscious part of you will agree to what the guy with a million subscribers already said. Dark Souls 2 isn't a bad game, doesn't have bad gameplay, it has questionable gameplay and design decisions that will make the game feel worse to some. It lacks visual polish and detail in a lot of areas. The enemies and bosses aren't as impressive as other games in the series. The world design seems nonsensical on an aesthetic level, but it ultimately works in terms of player progression. The early game is extremely tough and welcoming to players who are used to having 10 Estus, a strong shield, easy backstabs and many iframes from the start. And together with the stronger focus on crowd control and positioning, all of those things were bound to throw some people off. And these people might then refuse to adapt to these changes because their ego was already challenged and satisfied by the previous game in the series. Many outsiders to the community have complained that a lot of criticism towards the series is ignored and dismissed by fans. The very common and toxic sentiment that someone who has something negative to say about the design or other elements is simply a bad player who was filtered. This happened and happens quite a lot, and in fact I think every entry in the series, despite DS2, is actually a bit overpraised and under-criticized because of it. But why would the DS2 be exempt from that? Why would players who jacked off over the difficulty of DS1 or other Miyazaki games hate the second one specifically? Well, here is my take on it. Dark Souls 2 was actually overpraised at launch. It received stellar reviews, and many criticisms moved against it were quickly dismissed with the usual "get good" or "you're just bad." Obviously the game had its own apparent flaws and differences that made fans of the first game complain as well, and it didn't take long for these sentiments of unsatisfaction within the fanbase to spread and become more common and vocal. Soon all the people dismissing outside criticism stopped doing that and joined the bandwagon. Dark Souls 2 was different from 1, and being good at the game didn't necessarily carry over. The direction was clearly different, and the same people who would spout "get good" ad nauseam were also generally people involved enough in online discourse to quickly find out the game wasn't made by the same team as the first one. So these people who got good at DS1 might have felt offended that a game carrying the same name, despite being so different, was asking them to get good again. It's possible, because this is all a conjecture, that DS2 became a scapegoat, the sacrificial lamb that toxic fans of the Souls games could use to wash themselves of the sins of overpraising the first game. Some toxic fans couldn't admit that maybe the casuals were right about some things all along. It was easier to claim that the newest game was simply bad. And honestly, who could blame them? The game was clearly different and the director was different. Tanimura in part, but mostly B-Team became infamous in the community for being responsible for making a poor sequel to Dark Souls. So for once complaining from the casuals could be seen as legit, and not a consequence of lack of skill, patience or other virtues. If someone thought that DS1 had bad bosses, toxic fans would just call him a bad player. But if instead he thought that DS2 had bad bosses, well, this time he was right. DS1 was praised for being fair. Every time you died, it was your fault. Dark Souls 2 was now the actually unfair one, because it focused more on crowd control and severely nerfed some of the crutches that could make DS1 a breeze. I can't quite prove this sacrificial lamb theory, obviously, but I think I've proved the game isn't nearly bad enough to warrant the hate it received, so an additional explanation was needed. I'm not saying that you aren't allowed to dislike the game, or that if you do you are either brainwashed, lying to yourself or some other thing. there are very legitimate reasons to be put off by it. For example, if the empty, boxy rooms with repeated textures that make up the level design really bother you, I can understand that. After all, the quality of a piece of art or entertainment is mostly subjective. Some pros and cons can be considered undeniable truths, but how much they affect our enjoyment or distaste for the complete work isn't set in stone. It comes completely down to personal preferences and inclinations. I believe that DS2 simply didn't deserve all the shit it received, and I hope you can now find my position reasonable. I'll wrap up discussion on DS2 talking about one of its more understated aspects: atmosphere. Personally, I love it. Sure, DS2 is more gamey than the other entries. The areas look more fake, and the bosses aren't as visually imposing or cool. The world design makes little sense to add insult to injury. But I find 2 to be the one that feels the most like an adventure. A lot of people say 1 did this better, but I think the constrained world was very limiting in that regard. In contrast, I really like how the sequel presents itself. The game creates interesting sub-narratives through its progression and world building. For example, the Iron King's domain. You start in the forest where undead hunts took place, and where the hunters themselves have fallen to the curse they were trying to eradicate. Everything is dark, eerie and oppressive. You then reach the Valley Mifa, spoiled and ruined to extract poison. After killing her in her puppet-infested tower, you ascend to an opulent iron castle, sinking into lava, where the king was transformed into a fiery demon after dying at the hands of its accursed golem. Or take Vendrick's journey, with us following in the footsteps of this one mighty king, after his disappearance at the height of a war against the giants. We go to his castle, isolated and hidden away, turned into a series of traps and gauntlets to test us. We traverse it, face the Mirror Knight during a thunderstorm, and then descend into the depths of Earth, where the Shrine of Amana lies. A magical, beautiful place, which seems to hide something more sinister. This long trek across the swamp almost feels like a funeral march of sorts, as it leads into a catacomb, covered in darkness, silent, eerie, an ancient place untouched by time and light. We fight its denizens, and Vendrick's soldiers and knights that were left behind, and at last we find him, reduced to a mindless husk, wandering in a room surrounded by an ominous and endless darkness. I think that's just great. Overall, I find Dark Souls 2 to be a beautiful and memorable journey, and to me that has more value than graphical imperfections or some weird hitboxes here and there. You are free to dislike the game for any of its many flaws or failures to meet your expectations, but I will now ask you the following. Can you genuinely say DS2 was poorly designed? Has this video in any way changed your view on it? I hope it allowed you to look at the game in a different way. Now we'll have to move on to the next games in the From Software's catalog. I want to take a brief look at these sequels, if you wanna call them that way, and see how the formula and combat system change with each entry, how every iteration builds upon the previous ones, how the franchise as a whole was affected, and whether or not the fanbase and audience had anything to do with it, or whether Dark Souls 2 had anything to do with that. So, buckle up, because we're entering a new age of Souls games.